Could the most fragile alliance in World War II history have been dismantled not by the enemy, but by the ego of its own greatest generals? It is September 1944, and the fate of the Western Front rests on a knife's edge. On one side, George S. Patton demands total war. On the other, Bernard Montgomery insists on absolute control. Trapped between these two titans is Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, the only man who saw the impending disaster. If Smith's own generals were willing to burn their own strategy to sacrifice the war effort to satisfy their egos, could one man stop them, or was the collapse of the alliance already inevitable? The argument inside the aircraft was not a debate. It was an ultimatum. Montgomery, convinced that the German Wehrmacht was on the verge of total collapse, demanded that Eisenhower divert the bulk of Allied fuel, bridging equipment, and air support to his 21st Army Group for a narrow, deep penetration strike toward the Ruhr. He argued that this single, full-blooded thrust would end the war by Christmas, bypassing the logistical strain of supplying multiple armies across a broad front. Eisenhower, however, was tethered to a broader operational reality. He knew that to starve the other Allied armies would be to invite a strategic catastrophe should Montgomery's gamble fail. If you were sitting in that plane, listening to a field marshal threaten the stability of your command structure, would you yield to his tactical certainty or risk a fracture in the alliance to preserve your strategic caution? Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, observed this friction with a growing sense of dread. Known affectionately as Beetle, Smith was the man tasked with turning Eisenhower's grand strategic visions into the cold, hard math of fuel tons and shipping lanes. He knew that the logistics in the theater were already pushed to the brink, and that Montgomery's proposal necessitated stripping Patton's Third Army of the gasoline required to keep his momentum alive in the center. Smith was not just an administrator, he was the man who had to deliver the bad news to the commanders, whose ambitions he was about to stifle. When Smith warned Montgomery that the intelligence reports regarding German troop strength in the north were being dangerously underestimated, the field marshal simply waved the concerns aside, dismissing the warning as the caution of a staff officer who didn't understand the collapse of the enemy. How could a commander of Montgomery's stature dismiss high-level signals intelligence that explicitly contradicted his operational assumptions? The intelligence evidence was not mere conjecture. Ultra-intercepts from Bletchley Park had clearly identified the movement of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions into the very area where the Allied airborne troops were destined to land. These were not the demoralized stragglers Montgomery expected to encounter. They were elite, battle-hardened formations regrouping to refit. When Bedell Smith personally traveled to Montgomery's headquarters to press this point, he was met with a wall of immovable confidence. Montgomery viewed the war through a lens of methodical, set-piece battles, where success was dictated by rigid adherence to a pre-planned schedule, and any intelligence that threatened the timeline was viewed as an obstacle to be cleared, rather than a reality to be respected. Why would a seasoned commander who had built his reputation on careful preparation ignore the very data that should have defined the success of his master plan? By the time the final go-ahead was given for Operation Market Garden, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had been forced into an impossible balancing act. Smith's staff had to prioritize fuel shipments to the 21st Army Group while trying to avoid a full-scale mutiny from Patton, who was being told to sit and wait at the Moselle River. Patton was not a man who took no well. To him, the redirection of resources to the north was not just a logistical decision. It was a political conspiracy by the British to deny American forces the final glory of breaking into Germany. Smith, caught in the middle, had to use every ounce of his diplomatic leverage to ensure that the alliance did not dissolve into open infighting. Was it possible for Bedell Smith to maintain the appearance of neutral administrative oversight while knowing the strategic cost of the redirection he was executing? The frustration within the American camp reached a boiling point on September 17, 1944. As the Allied airborne armada darkened the skies, the logistical reports filtering into Smith's office told a grim story. Fuel trucks were stalled, spare parts were trapped in bottlenecks, and the sheer volume of supplies being funneled toward the northern axis was beginning to starve the entire theater of the flexibility needed to respond to unexpected German movements. Smith sat in his office reviewing the daily tonnage reports, knowing that he had just signed away the ability of the Third Army to react if the Germans decided to counterattack elsewhere. Every gallon of fuel diverted was a tactical asset neutralized in a theater that required constant, fluid maneuvering. If you were the man responsible for the logistics of the entire Allied invasion, how would you justify the potential immobility of your entire centerline force for the sake of one ambitious northern gamble? The failure of the intelligence assessment became glaringly apparent within hours of the initial drops. German resistance was not the hollow, fragmented opposition expected. It was sharp, reactive, and bolstered by heavy armor that had been positioned in the very corridors the airborne divisions were ordered to secure. Major Brian Urquhart, the intelligence officer for the 1st Airborne Corps, had tried to warn his superiors about these very divisions, but his warnings had been dismissed as overly cautious. He was subsequently relieved of his duties, sent on mandatory rest leave, a decision that effectively silenced the only voice that had accurately predicted the nightmare unfolding at Arnhem. How does a command structure deal with the reality of an intelligence failure that it has essentially manufactured by ignoring its own dissenting experts? As the situation on the ground deteriorated, the SHAEF headquarters became the epicenter of a desperate scramble for narrative control. Bedell Smith found himself in a position he had spent his entire career trying to avoid, managing a crisis that he had accurately predicted but was powerless to stop. The calls for reinforcements grew frantic, and the logistical conduits that Smith had so carefully restricted were now clogged with the failed attempts to rush ground support up the narrow Hell's Highway. Every request for fuel and bridging equipment sent to the north was now being diverted into a black hole of tactical failure, while the southern front, left intentionally stagnant by the command's own directives, remained entirely unable to assist. The political cost of the operation's failure was mounting with every passing hour. How could Bedell Smith begin to prepare for the inevitable blame shifting that would occur between the British and American commands when the true scope of the disaster became public? Patton's reaction to the unfolding disaster in the north was, as expected, incandescent. He communicated his disgust through channels that were intentionally public, making it clear to the combined chiefs of staff that the failure in Holland was the direct result of logistical mismanagement by SHAEF. Smith had to act as the shock absorber for these outbursts, mediating between the furious Patton and an Eisenhower who was still attempting to protect Montgomery's reputation. The alliance was fracturing, and Smith knew that if he could not maintain a semblance of professional unity, the political backlash in Washington and London would be catastrophic. What alternative methods could a chief of staff employ to keep a subordinate general like Patton from publicly undermining the Supreme Allied Commander? The crisis reached its peak when the British 1st Airborne Division found itself isolated at the Arnhem Bridge. The 90% success narrative that Montgomery would later claim was nowhere to be found in the reality of the reports crossing Smith's desk. He had to coordinate the efforts to extract what remained of the airborne forces, all while Montgomery continued to insist that the operation was progressing as planned. Smith was effectively being asked to assist in the maintenance of a reality that did not exist. The moral strain of knowing that soldiers were dying for a strategic miscalculation he had warned against, and which his own headquarters was now spinning to protect, was taking a toll on his health and his composure. If you were the chief of staff, would you maintain your loyalty to your commander-in-chief? Or would you force a confrontation that could potentially lead to your own dismissal and the collapse of the coalition? In the aftermath of the evacuation, Smith was tasked with drafting the sanitized version of events that would eventually form the bedrock of the official historical record. He oversaw the integration of reports that emphasized the courage and gallantry of the men, while conveniently omitting the persistent warnings about the German panzers and the disregard shown by the field commanders. This was not a lie in the traditional sense, but a masterclass in bureaucratic narrative management. By centering the failure on external factors like weather and the sheer bad luck of the geography, Smith ensured that the political fallout remained manageable. But deep down, he knew the truth of the Arnhem warning, and the failure of that warning would haunt the corridors of SHAEF for the remainder of the war. How does one accurately record a disaster in official documents while simultaneously ensuring the institution responsible for the disaster survives? The resentment that built up during those weeks in October 1944 did not disappear. It metastasized. The American Officer Corps, led by those who had watched their logistical requests denied, began to view SHAEF as an entity that favored British political necessity over American operational efficiency. Smith was the face of this perception, and he found himself isolated from many of his own countrymen in the field. He had performed his duty to warn, he had followed orders to implement the plan, and he had managed the aftermath with clinical precision. Yet in the eyes of his peers, he was merely the architect of their frustration. Was this professional isolation a price Bedell Smith was willing to pay for the sake of maintaining the fragile Allied command structure? As the winter of 1944 turned into the spring of 1945, the lessons of Market Garden began to manifest in the way Smith approached the planning of the final drive into Germany. He became far less reactive and significantly more anticipatory. When the rumors of a new rogue crossing of the Rhine began to circulate within Patton's Third Army, Smith did not simply issue a reprimand. He began to look for ways to manage the outcome before it could become another Arnhem. The dynamic between the Allied commanders had shifted. The British were no longer the sole strategic drivers, and the Americans, emboldened by their recent successes, were no longer interested in waiting for permission. Smith had learned that the only way to prevent a public rupture was to provide the rogue commanders with enough bureaucratic cover to succeed without appearing to violate the sanctity of the command chain. How can a chief of staff distinguish between an act of insubordination that should be punished and one that should be covertly enabled? The final move toward the Rhine would present Patton with the perfect opportunity to enact the revenge he had been plotting since the failures in Holland. As his armies neared the river at Arnhem, he did not wait for the long-winded, methodical planning process that Montgomery favored. He sought a bridgehead with the same aggressive, impulsive energy that defined his entire career. He knew that the moment he stepped across, he would be in direct defiance of the logistical directives that Smith had been forced to maintain at the behest of the combined chiefs. Yet this time, Patton had Bradley's tacit support, and he had the results to justify his actions. The question remained, would Smith enforce the old, failed rules of the Broad Front, or had the experience of Market Garden fundamentally changed his view of what constituted Allied success? On the night of March 22, 1945, the orders for the crossing were finalized in a clandestine atmosphere that stood in total contrast to the formal, committee-driven planning of Arnhem. Patton had his engineers stockpiling assault boats and bridge components, mislabeling them as defensive equipment to avoid the scrutiny of SHAEF's logistical inspectors. Smith, sitting at his desk at the headquarters, began to see the reports of these irregularities hitting his inbox. He was faced with the most critical decision of his tenure: to strike the blow that would end the insubordination of the Third Army, or to look the other way and allow the war to be won on Patton's terms. The shadow of the Arnhem failure loomed large in his mind, and the memory of that ignored warning was about to influence the outcome of the final decisive campaign in the West. If you were the man who had to decide whether to stop a rogue general, knowing that his success could save thousands of lives but also destroy the chain of command, what would you choose? Patton's crossing at Arnhem was not merely a military maneuver. It was an act of tactical defiance that threatened to undo everything SHAEF had worked to stabilize. As the Third Army's assault boats touched the eastern bank of the Rhine on March 23, 1945, the reports reached Bedell Smith's desk with the weight of an impending administrative earthquake. Smith held the power to order a halt, to cite the rigid logistical directives that had governed the Rhine crossings, and to demand that Patton wait for the coordinated effort. Instead, he did something that would have been unthinkable just months prior. He suppressed the logistical red flags. He recognized that the momentum Patton had generated was no longer a liability, but an asset that, if properly harnessed, could shatter the last vestiges of German defensive cohesion. But by enabling Patton, was Smith demonstrating true leadership? Or was he simply surrendering the last remnants of centralized Allied authority to a general he could no longer control? Montgomery, upon learning that the Americans had successfully established a bridgehead, erupted in a fury that echoed all the way back to the discord of Market Garden. He demanded that Eisenhower intervene, insisting that the priority for bridge-building equipment and air support remain with the 21st Army Group, as had been promised in the original, broader operational plan. Smith stood at the epicenter of this final rivalry, listening to the heated exchanges and knowing that the integrity of the alliance was being tested to its absolute limit. He understood that if he allowed Montgomery to dictate the terms, the war would drag on for weeks longer, at an immeasurable cost in lives. Smith had to perform a delicate, dangerous dance. He had to reassure Montgomery that his northern offensive was still the priority, while simultaneously funneling every spare bolt, pontoon, and fuel barrel to Patton's rapidly expanding bridgehead. Is it possible for a leader to maintain their personal integrity while knowingly practicing such sophisticated and systematic deception against their own commanders? The logistical reality of the Rhine crossing stood in stark contrast to the failures at Arnhem. At Arnhem, the lines of communication had been stretched to the breaking point. At the Rhine, Smith had learned to bend the rules to ensure the center remained fluid. He had established a network of decentralized supply caches that could be tapped into by the lead elements of any division, without requiring the explicit, multi-layered authorization that had bottlenecked the northern advance. This was a direct, albeit quiet evolution in his management style, born from the bitter lessons of September 1944. As the reports of the Third Army's rapid progress flooded in, Smith felt the weight of his decision. He had traded the illusion of perfect control for the reality of rapid, albeit messy victory. Was this shift from strict adherence to flexible pragmatism a sign of Smith's growth as a chief of staff? Or was it a dangerous departure from the doctrine that had theoretically held the coalition together? The tension between Smith and the intelligence directorate also underwent a profound shift. At Arnhem, intelligence had been treated as an abstract, something that could be managed or ignored if it didn't align with the operational timeline. By the time of the Rhine, Smith was actively seeking the most pessimistic reports from his staff, using them as a diagnostic tool rather than a nuisance. He knew that the Germans were not yet defeated, and he refused to fall into the trap of overconfidence that had defined Montgomery's previous assumptions. He insisted on briefings that highlighted German strength, not to curb aggression, but to ensure that Patton's thrust was supported by genuine, actionable information. If an intelligence department is only as useful as the person listening to it, how much of the disaster at Arnhem should be attributed to the intelligence analysts themselves, and how much to the command culture that silenced them? The climax of the Rhine campaign did not arrive with a thunderous clash of armies, but in the rapid, unhindered collapse of the German defensive line. Patton's forces, fueled by the supplies Smith had quietly prioritized, bypassed the set-piece battles that the Wehrmacht had been waiting for. It was a victory of logistics over tradition, a triumph of the flexible command that Smith had enabled. Yet for Smith, there was no sense of triumph, only a deep, weary relief. He had survived the political minefields, the insubordination, and the logistical impossible. He had also learned a chilling lesson. In modern warfare, the survival of the command structure itself is often more difficult than the destruction of the enemy. Would the lessons of Market Garden and the Rhine have been so effectively implemented if Eisenhower had been present and healthy during every single one of those decisions? As the war entered its final bloody weeks in April 1945, the dynamic between the commanders had irrevocably changed. Montgomery, sensing that the Americans were now in the driver's seat, became increasingly insular, focusing on his own objectives in northern Germany to ensure a British seat at the post-war table. Patton, emboldened by his success, pushed ever harder, often ignoring directives entirely. Smith, as the intermediary, found his role reduced to that of a high-stakes referee who had run out of penalties to call. He focused entirely on the orderly transition of the occupation, ensuring that the logistical machine he had built could be dismantled as efficiently as it had been assembled. How do you maintain professional discipline in an officer corps that has already mentally pivoted toward post-war political ambitions? The true cost of the conflict within the Allied command became clear only in the post-war archives. Documents would later reveal that the friction between the British and American leadership was not just about fuel or timing. It was about two different visions for the future of Europe. Smith, in his role as chief of staff, had been forced to navigate this deep ideological divide, often at the expense of his own reputation. He had been the bad guy to both sides, too bureaucratic for Patton and too American for Montgomery. Looking back, should Smith have been more transparent about the political pressures acting on the SHAEF command? Or was his silence the essential ingredient that kept the coalition from collapsing when it mattered most? The final surrender of the German forces in May 1945 was, for Smith, not a moment of celebration, but the conclusion of a relentless, exhausting process of administration. He had been the hand that turned the dials of the entire theater, the voice that calmed the egos of the greatest generals of the age, and the mind that balanced the logistics of a global war against the realities of a fractured coalition. He had seen what happens when commanders lose their objectivity to their own ambitions, and he had seen what happens when logistical reality is ignored. As he looked at the surrender documents, did he see the victory of his own methods? Or did he see a world that had been saved only by the narrowest of margins, despite the constant infighting at the top? The irony of Smith's tenure as Chief of Staff is that he remains a largely misunderstood figure. He is often characterized as a technician, an efficient cog in the machine that Eisenhower operated. But he was, in reality, the person who kept the machine from tearing itself apart. His ability to manage the egos of men like Patton and Montgomery, while simultaneously tracking the logistics of millions of men, is perhaps the most underrated contribution to the Allied victory in the West. If history had been written by the generals themselves, would they have credited Bedell Smith for the success of their campaigns? Or would they have continued to blame him for every logistical limitation they encountered? As we look back at the decisions made in that pivotal autumn of 1944, the debate over Market Garden continues to rage. Some still argue that it was a bold, necessary risk that just missed the mark. Others see it as the clearest example of the vanity of command overriding the reality of the situation. Smith's role in this is the ultimate test of the staff officer's dilemma. When do you push back against a commander whose plan you know will lead to disaster? Does a subordinate's duty end at the recommendation? Or does it continue until the operation itself is halted, even at the risk of mutiny? The Arnhem warning was a real, documented, and ignored reality, and its consequence was a brutal, unnecessary loss of life. The logistical redirection that followed was a direct attempt to patch the hole left by that failure, which only served to aggravate the existing frictions. The final resolution of these tensions at the Rhine was not a victory of planning, but a triumph of adaptation, a lesson that Smith had to learn the hard way through the fire of the previous autumn. Why do we consistently prefer the myth of the master strategist over the reality of the pragmatic administrator in our historical narratives? Perhaps the most significant lesson of the Bedell Smith and Allied command story is that the correct decision is often the one that is most politically difficult to implement. Smith had to swallow his pride, his professional judgment, and his personal sense of justice to keep the alliance together. He had to be the person who said no when he wanted to say yes, and who facilitated successes that he knew were built on flawed foundations. If you were placed in his position, tasked with managing the egos of the world's most powerful commanders during its most desperate hour, could you have maintained the same level of discipline and professional neutrality? The legacy of the Allied logistical machine in 1944 and 1945 remains a template for modern military management. The shift toward decentralized decision-making, the importance of accurate intelligence dissemination, and the recognition that even the best plans require flexible administrative support. Smith's journey from a rigid, by-the-book administrator to a pragmatist who understood the necessity of enabled insubordination is a blueprint for leadership under extreme pressure. In the end, it was not the brilliance of one man that won the war, but the ability of a very few people to manage the inherent flaws of the commanders tasked with winning it. The final, lingering question is not whether the war could have been won faster, but whether it could have been won with less loss if the command structure had been more honest with itself. The tragedy of Arnhem was not just a military failure. It was a failure of the human capacity to admit when one is wrong, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Bedell Smith saw this failure from the inside, and he lived with the consequences of it for the rest of his career. What would our view of the Second World War be today if those in command had possessed the humility to heed the warnings of their own staff? The history of Bedell Smith and the SHAEF command is at its heart a story of the tension between the ideal of total control and the reality of fragmented human ambition. It is a story that repeats itself in every conflict, in every political crisis, and in every large organization. By understanding the choices made by Smith, we gain a clearer, more nuanced view of the leadership required to navigate a world where information is always incomplete and where the costs of the wrong decision are counted in the lives of the soldiers who had no choice but to follow. If you were in Bedell Smith's position, knowing a tactical plan was fundamentally flawed due to ignored intelligence, would you have publicly defied your superiors to potentially save thousands of lives? Or would you have stayed the course to maintain the stability of the alliance? Let us know your perspective in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.